headlines. Are you interested with linguistics? If you are not so sure, maybe you can check this video and together we'll find out about the 5 theories of language and language acquisition. So, a little backstory. We know that languages came from language roots or language families before it came to what we are familiar with today. But what makes us strive to make languages? Have you ever wondered how innovative our tongues could be to undergo from these transition phases? Maybe sound, body language, maybe formed from conversation, ideas. Let's check what we've got. So here are the theories, and let me pick one. I'll go with here, cognitive. So cognitive is simply defined as the mental process that simply involves intellectual aspect of a person, includes how we interpret colors, our pacing while calculating algebraic equations, or the ability to test out the memory to describe something 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, maybe I more nervous. Theories are intellectual indeed, like Noam Chomsky, for example. On one hand, cognitive theory was traced back from John Piaget, who claimed that children upon birth obtain cognitive abilities but not adequate enough for higher mental function until developed through repeated exposure and exploration for the experiences that completes the mental functioning of a learner. Under these frame, the cognitive ability will keep in sync with the language ability of a child for the better understanding of the world. It is a pride for the cognitive theory affiliates to help the children. Let's say the parenting stress index. Maybe you can also relate, where in one related study by Spratty and Scar, researchers of a psychology journal entitled The Effects of Early Neglect in Cognitive, Language, and Behavioral Functioning in Childhood, wherein in 2012 they emphasized children's cognitive behavior and language vulnerability and deficits due to early exposure to unstable environment with extreme parenting stress. Due to early exposure to unstable environment with extreme parenting stress. So another great influence of the cognitive theory is that it is constantly helpful to solve crimes, forensic activities, like how Ted Bundy's pornography addiction before to sexual murders. What led him to confess without affection? There is something behind his language, so they dissect his childhood stories, an example of reductionistic explanation that is used in cognitive approach. Cognitive theory also has drawbacks, some of which are the inadequate explanation why there are cases of language sophistication with low IQ or genetic disorders. For example, Christopher Taylor, a polyglot savant who speaks 16 languages but scores a very low IQ since he was diagnosed with autism under the study of Smith and Champlain in 1998 of their modules and quasi-modules, Language and Theory of Mind and Polyglot Savant. Another disadvantage is portal it went to is the deficit in ecological consideration, since it mainly focuses on the cognitive. The experimentation process may affect the mental and behavioral process of a learner, like a memory performance of homeschooled students compared to those in traditional classroom. The brain is so fascinating for its complex connections to language by referring to the role of the cognition and the behavioral effects. Moving on, children are not just about potential to acquire language, but are expected to construct and develop this potential to a mental model of the world. Therefore, Piaget has 4 stages of children's progress: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. These illustrate how infants experience the development of their basic mental structure that relates to the language learning. The bottom line of the approach is that thought drives the language development by undergoing the universal status. One of the best known terminologies from Piaget's research is accommodation and assimilation. The former talks about the process of interpreting new ideas from pre-existing schemes. For example, a child might learn that her grandparents have white hair, so he concludes that every person who has white hair is old. On one hand, latter changes pre-existing schemes to fit the new ideas, like wheelchairs for people with orthopedic conditions. They complement each other, which is pivotal. And for the next theory, we also have discourse theory. On one hand, the discourse theory was introduced to denote the language manner and producing communicative inclination. Discourses produce a reality by establishing what an individual can think, say, or do. One example of approaches to discourse that I have found interesting is Michael Silverstein, who introduced the tripartite sign theory of peers as the basis for the study of language. These are the sign, the object, and the interpretant. In simple terms, this triadic model is how he perceives the signs and its relationships to the object it is referring to. For example, a semiotic exploration towards coffee, a brewed beverage, yet it associates with alertness, cozy, and home, which falls into insights developed under social bipartite theory of science, which points or shows contiguity to its subject. Relevancy. The third dimension ideally mediates social relations due to rationalizations of language, while under the control of functional institutions as per parameters of meanings that can be drawn. Alright, so let's welcome social production. On the linguistics perspective, the discourse theory has hidden meanings behind text and verbal, which are the difficult part to disclose in the micro and macro level. In micro level, it lets to use concepts in a more dynamic context. At macro level, that has limited attention on distribution availability and access to various sources of communication. The discourse in terms of social-linguistic variation relates to the language acquisition through the interactive implications in the social context, like register. Therefore, here in anthropological perspective, social linguistics contributes in acquiring language within a speech community across generations. Monitor theory. In brief, the monitor theory of Stephen Krashen claimed that a distinction between acquisition and learning is the response of the learner on the monitoring the language produced. The former happens on the subconscious level of linguistic consensus, while the latter is gained the conscious knowledge of language structures and form. L1 is programmed for the initiative to acquire language that stimulates the development of second language competence. Herein, the title monitor embodied the monitoring of the learning system when specified conditions are met: sufficient time, focus and form, and know the roles. The given empirical evidence and explanation are quite critical on the second language acquisition is per individual variation of monitoring into optima. There are 5 hypotheses of this model that represented below. Acquisition learning hypothesis, monitor hypothesis, affective filter hypothesis, natural order hypothesis, and input hypothesis. Saiful Muna made an article focused in this entitled Modern Modal Theory in Second Language Acquisition. You may read an article for simple definitions of each. However, this is only disadvantages since we cannot monitor the learning system if the conditions are not met. Since it's centralized correction, the language user must be knowledgeable about the rules to correctly monitor the usage. Therefore, this is an overarching research that allows the learners to discrete the difference between language learning and language acquisition. Alright, and the next, social interaction. Oh, I love this one. It is largely based on the social context that hypothesizes that social interaction is central to learning as a theory of Lev Vygotsky. Herein, the basis of learning is language, so he was convinced, but the social learning sprouts through social interactions that influence the cognitive growth of a learner. He highly encourages promoting cognitive growth through interactive approach like collaboration with linguistically skilled adults, constructive feedback, or productive discussions. Hence, Vygotsky created a unique avenue for social learning. He is a teacher, so that is one of the motivation in creating this theory, since teachers have a direct dialogue in an effort with the learners that facilitate learning. So I found this gem online, Lev Vygotsky, Sociocultural Theory of Cognitive Development by Dr. Serhat Kurt in 2020. That is simultaneous tenet of the social world. Vygotsky outlined three main concepts related to cognitive development. Culture is independent learning, language is the root of culture, and individuals learn and develop within their role in the community. There is no formed communication without culture, and culture is not traced back without communication by the use of a language. Also, it is best to see that cultural influence an individual in a man is consistently creating culture. People also are highly convinced of its role to the cognitive development that relates to the language learning. From the stages of childhood development, as a baby, we are familiar to the sound of our mothers or to familiar voices. These are elementary factors designed for our survival. These displays gradually fade out as a result of external stimuli, imitating, consequences, and conditioning by others. It is replaced with problem-solving skills such as reflection, bargaining, and reasoning. These higher-level thinking is influenced by cultural factors. Ethical relativism, for example. To support further, there is this development of speech in three stages. External or social speech occurs from birth until the age of 3. Babies use language to communicate their feelings, express their emotions, and share simple words. With this, I remember I cry when I'm hungry or in need of something. So the next stage, egocentric speech, occurs between the stages of 3 and 7. As they begin to rationalize internally their actions or behavior, children begin to talk to themselves. As the inner speech helps them control their reasoning and organize their thoughts, they continue to interpret meaning from their reactions of others, further integrating the cultural beliefs into their own cognitive development. He also proposed the idea of a zone of proximal development, which a child's language learning potential can be accomplished with supervision of competent one. For example, parents adjust to reference to account for their children's language knowledge and vocabulary, like comparing the cheetah to a cat to be easily understood. A study cannot depict the interests of people without criticisms. Some of the weaknesses of this theory are that Vygotsky argued that learners actively engage in the acquisition of language, for it neglects the role of genetics and passive experience of the learner. For critics, socialization are highlighted as a key to language learning, but why their children with an adequate social support cannot fully develop in cognitive aspect at a certain age. That is a good question. Lastly, allow me to introduce to you the variable competent. There are prominent figures that shares understanding within the idea of variable competence. One drawn argument is from Noam Chomsky, who makes the distinction between competence and performance clearer. Chomsky said, competence is the speaker's knowledge of the language, while the speaker's use of this language is performance, or the actual use of language in concrete situations.
whereas Theron claimed that there is no homogeneous competence which underlies a language performance but a variable or heterogeneous competence which underlies specific instances of language performance in the real world. Rod Ellis also supports this idea that language performance of students varies depending upon the conditions in operations at the time of the production. Style shifting is the umbrella term which is linked to the amount of attention which is paid to speech in a given speech situation. From the article entitled Variable Competence and Performance in Child Second Language Acquisition of Beverly Flanagan in 1991, Lebovian notion has been proposed as an alternative to the traditional view of LT competence as the essentially static and homogeneous knowledge. Here, the notion of variable competence as a model of second language acquisition has gained prominence in recent years. Based on Lebov's concept of inherent variability, it suggests that a speaker's grammatical competence, the linguistic system underlying a language use, consists not only of categorical rules which depend on linguistic context, but also of variable rules which are sensitive to social linguistic conventions, awareness of audience, attention to speech, and other factors. Thus, the notion of underlying system or innate competence is meaningless apart from its realization and performance, which is fundamentally and inevitably variable. So the issue becomes evident of a brief outline of these variable competence models. Gregg criticized these as varied knowledge and as variable knowledge, since some are aware of the fact that they use some forms of language in some situations and not in others. Yet, it has nothing to do with the knowledge of language, which we acquire from the paper of Glenn Fulcher of his variable competence in second language acquisition, a problem for research methodology. Other main problem is the learning of careful style and production of language. The vernacular style is criticized. It doesn't really explain the acquisition of language. This is the question. How do learners acquire variables rules? If variable rules really exist, and if they are not merely a tool to be used in social linguistics but are really part of capability, then we have to acquire them. Theron's view is that the learners first learns new structures and a careful style of speech, and then at a later date, these are produced spontaneously in the vernacular style.
By the end of the day, it is still good to hear and learn how to learn languages. We speak and understand our own, so maybe we can apply it to others too. And I have 3 topics: French, German, Italian. Those are good languages. What do you think? Any theory has its own critics, but nevertheless, they remain influential and useful today. This is Diva Tagalog, a Bachelor of Arts in English language student, your educator for the day.